Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Peter J. Boettke, who is a university professor of economics and philosophy at George Mason University, the director of the FA Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics and Economics, and the BB&T Professor for the Study of Capitalism at the Mercatus Center. He is the author of dozens of books, including his most recent publication titled F.A. Hayek, Economics, Political Economy and Social Philosophy. He has also co-authored and authored hundreds of papers. Personally, he has been an enormous intellectual influence as a teacher, mentor, and my dissertation advisor. We spoke about why artificial intelligence models will not solve the knowledge problem in economics, the feasibility of techno-socialism, the long history of scholars understanding and misunderstanding the market process, the Vienna, Virginia tradition of economics, mainline versus mainstream economists, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi, Pete. Welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to see you.
I'm thrilled to be here with you, Shruti. This is a great opportunity.
So I want to start with Hayek because I have learned so much of my Hayek from you. I took the Austrian sequence with you. You were my dissertation advisor. So when I have a Hayek question, it just feels about right to come to you. And recently, Daron Acemoglu, said on Twitter that the insights in the use of knowledge in society, which is Hayek's 1945 paper, is essentially a computational critique of planning, right? And so Acemoglu argues that Hayek argued that the market system efficiently aggregates information via the price system, and that Hayek posits that central planning wouldn't work because it would be impossible to collect and compute the right allocation of resources. And after sort of paraphrasing Hayek in this way, Acemoglu moves on to sort of pose this general question that in this current world of AI and large language models and this sort of incredible computational power that humans have acquired, what if central planning can be improved tremendously, right? And would Hayek then be happy with central planning? So this is the premise that he started with. I actually sent him the paper on Twitter, not just me, like 30 of us, I think, inundated Acemoglu with your recent paper with Rosalino Candela on the feasibility of techno-socialism. This was published recently in JABO. And you basically argue that there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the economic problem of society as being one of a computational nature rather than a knowledge problem. And this needs to be addressed. And the market process actually does address this problem, right? And that's Hayek's main insight. So before I get into the big debate, I wanted to frame it, but I want you to explain to most of our listeners who may not know the main insights of Hayek's 1937 paper, This is Economics and Knowledge, and Hayek's 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society. And then we can go on to the rest of it.
That's great. Great context, too. I think the key insight in Hayek's 1937 paper, Economics and Knowledge, is that the pure logic of choice is a necessary but not sufficient condition to explain the market order. In order to explain the market order, we have to also add in the various different institutional environments within which individuals interact with one another and which they interact with nature, and to see how it is that they learn in these alternative environments, how best to coordinate their economic activity with others. I think it's a great thing to start with the 37 paper because that's where Hayek really starts to articulate his particular understanding of what it is that prices do in an economy. And in my own book on Hayek, I try to tell the evolution of Hayekian ideas by an arc of his career. And I start with his own beginning, which was on the imputation problem, but carry from that imputation problem, basically, how is it that I value a hog? How the value of a hog is derived from the value of the bacon that's, consumers use. And that spreads back through the structure of production such that farmers want to maintain the hog and all those things like that. And so that's how you get the coordination of economic activities through time. And what is the role of prices in that coordination problem, because prices are these guides to future action. And what is the role of profit and loss accounting in being able to lure us into ventures and discipline us from the sad adventures, if we make mistakes or whatever, and that selection process of what's going on. So Hayek's early part of his career, which includes not only his business cycle theory, which is important to stress, his business cycle theory is a relative price story of the business cycle. So it's a micro foundational story of the business cycle. It's a price theoretic rendering of the business cycle. And then his critique of socialism, which he's building on Mises, is again a price theoretic explanation. And I think if you look at like his essay, A Trend of Economic Thinking in 1931, you could infer from that his argument is as follows. If you knew economics, you would know socialism doesn't work, because all good trained economists understand the role of property prices and profit and loss.
Yeah.
And that's 1931.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he's very successful in communicating originally his business cycle to the young, graduate students and great excitement to the community at the time in the 1930s and his move from Vienna to LSE. And by the mid-1930s, there starts to be rumbling that people are saying, no, I can use the very same neoclassical tools to prove that I could plan the economy. And I think Hayek starts thinking to himself after the Collectivist Economic Planning book, which is 1935, like, what's going on here, right? These are brilliant people like Abel Lerner, his student. And he's like, what's going on? Like, why is this happening? And so he comes up in the second arc of his career, which is a twofold move, I argue. One is that he thinks there's some deep philosophical mistake that economists have made, which misconstrue the nature of their science. But then there's also, because they misconstrued their science, there's a loss of the institutional foundations. So if you go all the way back to Hume's argument is that society, to get off the ground, needed to have stability of possession, transference by consent, and the keeping of promises. So you needed to have property, contract, and consent, which is an institutional foundation. There's a brilliant book by Lionel Robbins that was published in 1952, but originally written in 1939, before the war and before, but they had paper shortages and everything like that, so it couldn't come out. And it's on the theory of economic policy among the classical economists. And what Robbins argues in that is that the economists of the classical school, Smith, Hume, all the way up to Mill, they never argued about economics in a vacuum. Yeah. Economics was always embedded within a set of institutions. And what he postulates is that economic science grew up alongside of the evolution of liberal institutions of property, contract, and the rule of law. And they're embedded in one another. And many of us, like yourself, who's an expert in property rights economics and everything like that, you'll know that like Alchin begins by saying, let's begin the analysis in exchange and production or university economics. We're going to begin in a world where we have clearly defined and enforced property rights. And that's the basis of exchange. So to a large extent, when you treat something as given, it's easy to then treat it as forgotten. Yeah. And so Hayek's like, how could you forget property, contract, and consent? We need to bring that back into economics. And so in the 1940s, what he does, starting in the 1930s and into the 1940s, he does a dual move, which is one into philosophy of science, and then the other one is into the restatement of the liberal principles of political economy and justice. And that defines his career. So in my reading, Hayek never left economics. My view is he's the very first new institutional economist, which is he's saying, hey, wait a minute, guys, time out. We can't do economics as if it's in a vacuum. To try to do economics with omniscient agents and benevolent agents is the same as trying to do economics without scarcity, right? So, we say, if you said to me, what's the economics of heaven? I would say there is no economics of heaven because there's no scarcity, therefore there's no trade-offs. But when we postulate economic actors that are omniscient and benevolent, we're doing the same thing. And so Hayek is saying, no, we can't, do that. So now back to your question. So 1937 is his first foray into this. Now, his mentor in quotes, but mentor Mises, who is largely responsible for his career, what Mises did was he kind of divided the methodology into theory and to an empirics. Theory and empirics. And as a result, there's kind of a tough understanding, I would argue, about what it is that the market is. Because is the market the same as the derivation of the pure logic of choice, or is the market something different? And so Hayek reaches back intellectually, I would argue, to the original masters of Austrian economics, which are both Bombavrik and, more importantly, Menger. And you have to remember, in both Bombavrik and in Menger, they make a three-part distinction. Pure theory, which is the rationation of the individual chooser. Then what they do is they develop the situational logic of how markets and how different rules that govern the market will dictate the different ways in which the outcomes come about. And then empirical analysis, historical analysis. So there's this really interesting area, which they called, either Menger calls it empirical realistic theory, or Bombavrik just calls it applied theory of price, which is going to be this institutionally contingent theory. And depending on the various institutional arrangements, we're going to have different manifestations of the logic of choice. So the logic of choice, the pure rationation, diminishing returns and that kind of, diminishing marginal utility and whatnot, that's still there, right? So I can get a demand curve to slope downward, right? But I can't necessarily get the interaction of the market unless I fill it with this institutional context of property, contract, and consent. Yeah. Most of the time, I just assume those things. So therefore, that's where the laws of supply and demand work, and there's no intervention, and I get, a notion of a sort of an unhampered market economy. But Hayek was saying, look, we need to look at how those institutions impact the way in which actors in the economy learn. Yeah. And that's the key thing. So what he's arguing is that the pure logic of choice is a necessary but not sufficient. This causes some Austrian types to have agita because they think he's deviating from Mises. The 37 paper, Pure Logic of Choice, the situational logic of various different institutional contexts, you combine the pure logic of choice with the situational analysis of institutions, and that forms your framework from which you then do empirical analysis. And that's Hayek's big 37 piece. And what his argument is that our justification of how markets operate is in applied theory, not in the pure theory. And that means that we have to have institutions. Now, what's the big thing for Hayek? The big issue for Hayek is that what makes institutional variation important is not the incentives that it structures. That's incentive institutionalism. Again, Hayek does not deny that, but that's not his point. His point is that different institutions have different learning characteristics to them. So one way to think about it is a classroom. And certain classrooms are more conducive to learning and other classrooms are less conducive to learning. And what Hayek was trying to say in essence is that an unhampered market economy, built on property, contract, and consent, is actually a really, really effective learning mechanism for economic actors. They are going to be hit with stark signals. And so it's not only that they respond quickly, but they respond correctly to the adaptation. I have a postcard that Hayek signed to somebody, to Pascal Salon, actually, is who we sent it to. And it says the following thing. It says that what makes the market process important is not that it adapts to change, but that it adapts to the constant need to readapt to change, because we're in this world of ceaseless change, right? So, okay. Now, we're talking about economic activity through time, not any static state of affairs. So we're not trying to look at the characteristic of a price that would generate an equilibrium. That's the idea of prices as a sufficient statistic. We are looking at prices as guides to our future activity. Now, it's true that prices economize, right? So he does make that point. But what they economize on is the amount of knowledge that we do to plan for the future, not the sufficient statistic tell me what an equilibrium condition is. So if I stand at standard price theory, price equals marginal cost, it tells me that the full opportunity costs are taken into account. I'm going to produce at the minimum point on the average cost curve, right? I got all these kind of conditions going in. To Hayek, those optimality conditions are byproducts of the market, not assumptions into the market. And so in that 37 piece, one of the things that he leverages is a argument by Morgenstern on the paradox of perfect foresight. Because his argument is that you can't have a market process theory in which the agents have perfect knowledge, because if they had perfect knowledge, they would in fact be trapped in a impasse. And Morgenstern uses the Holmes-Moriarty example, right? Holmes knows Moriarty's going to be on the train to Dover, but Moriarty knows that Holmes knows, and then you're stuck in this impasse, right? And what Hayek's point is not so much that the how do I solve the paradox of perfect foresight? It's that the paradox of perfect foresight is going to leave me unable to act. And so in the world of action, we are never having perfect knowledge. The perfect knowledge outcome is the byproduct when all of the process has in fact ceased because it's completed its job. So just to relate again back to broader people outside of Hayek, and I recommend to all of your listeners here to go online and look at the interview in the Hayek tapes with Armin Alchian.
Yes.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I'm going to invoke Armin Alchian. When Armin Alchian published the selection of his papers with Liberty Fund, the title of that collection was called Economic Forces at Work.
Yeah.
And what I love about that is it's not economic forces after they've worked, which is what we learn in textbooks. Yeah. When we learn what the equilibrium conditions are, those are the outcome after all the mechanisms have worked. That's in fact what equilibrium means. We've in fact worked through the process and we settled in, right? To use another example, Machlup used to make a joke, which he says, why do we draw a supply and demand curve if all we cared about was the P and Q vector that clears the market?
We so should the kid at the back of the class can see. They can't see it if it's just a point on the
It's just a vector, just a point. They can't see it, so the kid in the back has to see it. But what we really want to explain is all the exchange behavior that goes on prior to that, which, of course, as you know, as a student of Buchanan as well, that's Buchanan's big issue, is that economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. So all of the new institutional economics that comes about in 1950 to 1980, property rights economics, law and economics, public choice economics, entrepreneurial economics, all of that stuff derives in many ways from that 37 paper, because the 37 paper laid the space open for institutional analysis. But institutional analysis that doesn't deny the marginalist principles. Yeah. Prior to the 37 paper, to say I was an institutionalist would be say that there is no logic of choice, because as the institutions change, the people change, and therefore the laws of economics change. I'll use one last analogy in the hope of clarifying this position, and it comes from Mill, actually, but it's really discussed quite well in several papers by Dan Hausman, the economic methodologist, the philosopher. And he uses the example of a harbor and the law of tides, right? So the law of tides is a physical law built on the idea of gravitational pull as the Earth rotates around and what it does to the ocean levels and everything like that. And those are exact laws. Like, we know what those laws tell us. But when we build a harbor, what we do is we actually intervene into the nature, and we structure various different things with the way we build the harbor. And the way we build that harbor is going to affect the way in which the law of the tides manifests itself. And that's like what's going on in the market, because the institutional rules under which the market operates is not going to violate the idea that individuals striving to do the best that they can given their circumstances. What it does is it changes what it means for them to strive. And what Hayek is saying is that not only is it their incentive to strive, but it also is, how do they know what the right thing to do is to strive? Yeah. And that is dependent on these signals. So Hayek's, that paper, 37 paper, gives rise to contextual economics. The idea that economics always takes place in applied sense in a context. Now we get to the 45 paper, and his stress is that the data of the market, and this is going to get to your Acemoglu point, right? The data of the market is the data of the context. And that's why he says, the way he describes context, he says, is that it's the, knowledge of time and place of the actor. And not anyone can have it. So the problem in the market isn't treating given data and then processing it computationally. The problem is that you have to have the context. Otherwise, that data doesn't exist. In the 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, Hayek is trying to explain to his audience, as he says, he wants to use the term marvel to shock them out of their complacency. And I think it's important to remember that this was in the American Economic Review, not in Time magazine. So he's not talking to the average person. He's arguing that professional economists had become complacent about the functioning of the price system. And he wants to explain the functional significance of property prices and profit and loss for the coordination of economic activity through time. And he focuses on the power of relative prices to guide our decisions, and the idea that we are the individual is the man on the spot that has to actually act on those prices, interpret those prices, and then behave in accordance to those prices. And it's that idea of the price system as a whole and the telecommunication aspect of that that is crucial to his insights. In the 1945 paper, the reason why he calls it the use of knowledge in society as opposed to the use of information in society is that it's not just little bits and pieces of knowledge. It's knowledge that is not, in fact, given to us. It is generated through the very process of exchange and production activity that gives rise to the knowledge that we utilize, and it's only knowledge within that context. Outside of that context, it doesn't exist. It has to actually be context dependent, and that's a crucial aspect of his story. The socialist calculation debate was initiated in 1920 by Ludwig von Mises, and it was directed at people who believed that the experience of World War I planning could then be used in peacetime to be able to then organize the economy in disruptive times and to improve a better world. And they wanted to rationalize the economy. They called it the rationalization of production. And their goal was to rationalize production so that they would deliver mankind from the kingdom of necessity, world of scarcity, to the kingdom of freedom, into a burst of productivity in which they would be able to actually achieve all the wonders of the market without any of the disruptions, the anarchy of production, so to speak. And what Ludwig von Mises raised the challenge is that in their effort to achieve that, their goal was to abolish private property in the means of production. And Mises argued once they abolished the means of production, they would in fact eliminate the very means by which they could rationalize production. So that's why it's called the socialist calculation debate, because they were worried about rational economic calculation. And what rational economic calculation is the ability to sort from the array of technologically feasible projects, those which are economically viable. So an example is, if I'm choosing a railroad track, should I build that railroad track out of platinum or out of, steel? And you might say right off the bat, oh, platinum's too expensive. And I'll ask you why. And you'll say, oh, because the market price of platinum is too high. That's the point. Without private property, we wouldn't know that market price of platinum. So we would normally say, well, why don't we pick platinum? Because it's a technologically superior metal to steel in producing the railroad. But the problem is that would end up by producing less with more. We would be wasting resources because platinum could be used in alternative uses in much more effective ways. And without that guiding role of the price system, you're not going to be able to know that outcome. And so as a result, you're going to end up by having systemic waste. And therefore, the least thing that you'll do is have a rationalized production process. And instead, you'll be trapped and ensnared in an irrational process that, in fact, makes us poorer rather than delivers us from our sad state. Hayek and Mises did mention the incentive problem. Both of them go out of their way to say socialist managers will not face the same incentives. That's the oldest argument in intellectual history. It goes all the way back to Plato, to Aristotle's Critique of Plato. Okay? They also do argue that there is a computational problem, which is Pareto identified, which is that in a world of, of 700 goods and 100 people or whatever, you would still have to solve a system of simultaneous equations, blah, 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 blah. And and Baroni makes this argument as well. It's fascinating, in both Baroni and in Pareto, they argue that you cannot answer that question as a computer. It's not computable, but the market does it every day. People forget this, right? Because they think that they somehow proved in advance that Mises was wrong, but they don't. They just say, and Smith actually says it in the famous passage about the common woolen coat. He says the number of exchanges would be beyond our ability to compute, to be able for us to get the common woolen coat. It's just the way I think of what people are doing there is just trying to explain the amazing complexity that's involved in producing the simplest products. Here I'm standing at an iPhone. Right? Just think about all the component parts all throughout the world, all the knowledge that's embedded in that, and how you gather and put that all together. But that problem is not the significant problem. The significant problem is the generation of the knowledge that's in the context that tells people that I should do this kind of chip rather than that kind of chip. And I only get that if I'm in that context. If I'm not in that context, that never exists. So it's not that the knowledge is difficult to obtain. It doesn't exist. It It's not even there. It's like, and so that's what Hayek is trying to get at in the use of knowledge in society. But along the way, while he's doing it, he uses these various other, things. Prices economize the amount of information we use. Prices are, these, summary devices. They are a signal, an incentive wrapped in a signal. All those kind of arguments are in there as well. And so it depends on how people read it.
Yeah.
And the reason why someone as brilliant as Acemoglu will focus on that issue is because it's that issue that the mechanism design people picked up on.
Yeah.
So again, there's an interlocutor. So they took Hurwitz and all of them took Hayek's challenge seriously, and they said, okay, so I have to prove that I can actually generate a process which will be informationally efficient. All right, and that's all this computable stuff. And then you get to Lange, who in 1967 says, what's the problem? I now have a supercomputer. Yeah. But keep in mind that Lange is saying that we already have, Kantorovich developing linear programming. We have, various people who have tried to do this, even Leontief's input-output tables. So a lot of people in the planning field have already been trying to answer Hayek's challenge.
But before we get to the computational question, to me, it seems like there are 2-3 different aspects to this. So the first part of Hayek's insights in 37 and 45, which are lost, is the institutional context that you've pointed out. The second part, which I think has been lost, is subjectivism. Yeah. People will have a subjective interpretation of the facts before them, and they will have subjective expectations that they form about the future, even if we impose this some, bizarre sort of uniform incentive structure. These days, it's a lot in vogue to say that, everyone is individual, everyone is diverse. Yeah. We need to treat each person exactly like the special snowflake that they are. And it's sort of odd that Hayek did that, way back 100 years ago. And he's like, yes, each person is special because they have very specific knowledge, but that knowledge comes from their subjective view of the world, right? And this, of course, is the Mengerian tradition. So that's one part to me that seems to be lost. But the other part is this sort of conflation between the coordinating aspects of the price system and the computational aspect of the price system. So what you were telling me is that the price system, given certain institutions, private property, consent, exchange, contracts, it can create a system where all these different, bits of subjective dispersed knowledge can actually coordinate, right? And the price that pops up has managed to calculate all of that information the way we would in an economic model and spit out an objective number, right? And in equilibrium, that objective number that we can stick on things and all those subjective expectations about marginal cost, so all of that lines up sort of perfectly, right? But that's computational. And Hayek's argument is the price system is very low cost and efficient at computing in a way that, we have no other human or technological institution that can compute. But the other half of it is we actually don't have any mechanism to coordinate either, right? And the computing and the coordinating elements are fundamentally different. And the coordinating element comes from what you're talking about, which is the learning, which is this needs to happen in an institutional environment and so on. So can we separate computation from the epistemic aspects? Is that the source of the confusion in Acemoglu, or is something else going on here?
Well, it's a brilliant set of questions that you asked there, and I realize that I gave a very long-winded discussion of 37 and 45, and I do want to address some of the things, but I want to read a quote from Hayek talking about the reception of of Mises's ideas by other economists. He says, Mises' arguments were not easily apprehended. Sometimes personal contact and discussion were required to understand them fully. Though written in a deceptively simple prose, they tacitly presuppose an understanding of economic processes, an understanding not shared by all his readers. We see this most clearly in his crucial argument on the impossibility of economic calculation under socialism. This is the key point. When one reads Mises' opponents, one gains the impression that they do not really see why such calculation was necessary. They treat the problem of economic calculation as if it was merely a technique to make the managers of the socialist plan accountable for the resources entrusted to them and wholly unconnected with the problem of what they should produce and how. any set of magic figures appear to them sufficient to control the honesty of those self-indispensable survivors of the capitalist system. They seem never to comprehend that it is not a question of playing with some set of figures, but one of establishing the only indicators that managers could have for deciding the role of their activities in the whole structure of mutually adjusted activities. So it's, again, this generative and discovery aspect of it. And so this is the key issue, is that to Hayek and to Mises, what calculation does is it allows us to sort from the array of technologically feasible production projects those that are economically viable. And you have to do that sorting, otherwise you're going to have systemic error. And you'll end up not producing more with less, but less with more. And that's the very definition of irrational. And again, you have to remember, they did not say rational. They weren't the ones who said the goal was rationality. The socialist goal was rationalization of production, because the whole idea was that by rationalizing production, they would lead to a burst of productivity, which would deliver mankind from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. And so unless they can get rationalization of production off the ground, the socialist project crashes to the ground. So the search in all of this stuff, from Marx to Neurath to all the way up to, Alanga and Lerner, but then also, Kantorovich and all the rest of them, Leontief, it is to get rationalized production. And if I can show you that you don't have the generative process to be able to do that, then your project is going to crash and burn. So that's why it's called the decisive objection, right? That they have to forego the intellectual division of labor. But let me go back to your other point, which I think is really important, because this relates to Hayek's issue about the tacit understanding of the process. So what is the market made up of? The market, so Keynes had an idea of this. He called it the Keynesian beauty contest, right? And so he kind of understood this idea that the market isn't so much like what I think is the most beautiful. I'm trying to guess what I think other people think are the most beautiful and whatnot. And so the market is made up of judgments of others' judgments. That's how, what the phrase Hayek uses there, fit into the larger structure of the idea here. And so I'm trying to figure that out. In order to do that, I have to engage in some judgment, but I also have to have a tool of appraisement. So I realize whether or not I'm engaged in that activity the right way. And this all, of course, turns on the subjective costs that I, face in my decision making. And so one of the key things, going back to your pluralism idea, and there's a great exchange of letters between Jim Buchanan and Karen Vaughan that's in the Buchanan archives. Why didn't the debate just get stopped once Arrow wrote his famous paper, right? Because if I can't have a stable social welfare function, the planner doesn't tangentially kiss the point of the social welfare function on the outer frontier, the production possibility frontier. And so Buchanan's whole point in that 1949 paper, there's no fisc, right? So even in 49, he's arguing that, let alone in 54, when he really goes after Arrow, there is no stable social welfare function. If there's no stable social welfare function, what collective action is all about is exchange. And as he says, we must always return to the swamp, right? He's talking about mosquito abatement issue as an applied problem of collective action. But what he means by that is we have to be in this issue of the exchange process that makes up, collective action. And so if there's no stable social welfare function, there's no single scalar of values, there is no residual claimant over the entire economy. And part of the confusion, I think, in the debate, and maybe we'll talk about this, because you were the one who turned me on to the quote from Jack Ma, that I used to start the beginning of the feasibility paper. So you're the one who turned me on to that. And, he makes the argument that, look, in my business, we use all this, fancy computer, knowledge and algorithms to help me make my decisions. And I have a big business and we're doing all of that. And so why can't the world do that? And we can get rid of this messy process of the market and we could just have this. And I think that the issue is that there's a residual claimant in his business. There's a residual claimant for Amazon. There's a residual claimant for Walmart. There's not for the U.S. economy, or let alone the global economy. And instead, we have this diversity of ends that are being pursued. And the only thing we can agree upon is the means by which we interact with one another. And that allows for this greater scope of this. And that gets us back to the adaptation and agility of market mechanisms, or whatever mechanism. So I would say the following thing. If we agree that you have to sort from the desirable to the feasible to the viable, so whatever social system we're in, we have to go from desirable, this is what I dream to be the dream, to that is actually a feasible dream, to that's actually a viable dream. What we know is that under markets where you have property, prices, and profit and loss, we have built-in mechanisms that are going to prod us, are going to lure us, are going to, guide us, and are going to discipline us. So we have constant feedback and constant movements that's going through. That functional significance of property, prices, and profit and loss has to be mimicked by something else.
Yes.
If we get rid of private property, we're going to have some other mechanism that does the same thing of prodding us, of guiding us, of luring us, and disciplining us. So now the question is, what is that? Is that voting? So now we're in comparative institutional analysis. Is it voting? Is it beauty? Is it, is it some,
status,
special,
caste,
yes,
whatever.
Yeah. And in the history of mankind, we've had all kinds of different ways to do this, right? I mean, and some of which are very ugly, actually, when we see them done, but we've done it. And what they haven't been able to do is produce advanced material production on the scale. So they don't rationalize production. We end up by producing less with more, and we waste resources and things like that, as opposed to the efficiency that's generated by the market mechanism. And I think that we should learn from that lesson and have a very important conversation about that.
Do you think they went horribly wrong because they called it the impossibility of socialist calculation as opposed to something like the impossibility of being able to substitute the market process? Because now the entire focus is on calculation, which makes it seem like there is a calculator, right? They think, we've sort of in some sense personified the market process or what we get at the end of it as if there is a person who's sitting with a dinky little calculator making all those calculations. And the main problem that Lange and Lerner had was that Leontief's mainframe computer wasn't large enough.
Right.
So do you think this is just people didn't read the entire thing because it was all old school history of thought? What stuck was information economics and impossibility of calculation. And from there, we have completely derailed because we have lost the epistemic part and divorced it from the computation part.
So I think that there's a couple things that are going on. Again, your insight is very valuable, I think. One, Mises's article is not translated into English until 1935.
Yeah.
So, Robbins and Hayek are actually, more communicating the debate once it's out of its German context. So in the German context, though, from Neurath through Karl Polanyi and other kind of people, and even if you go back before Mises to Weber, when Weber talks about socialism in one of his famous essays from 1919 or whatever, or Mises in his book on war socialism, which is also 1919, Nation, State, and Economy, where he talks about this issue. It was other people who said there was a calculation problem that needed to be solved, but it could be solved by mechanisms other than the market. So again, Mises is adopting a challenge. Now, part of that challenge is in the old Marxists was that you could use labor units, right? This addresses your subjectivism point or whatever. You could use labor units to do it. Or, somebody, or Neurath was saying, look, we did it in the war economy. Why can't we just do what we did in the war economy, do this? But the problem with that is that in war, you turn the economic problem into a technological problem because you have one end, right? And so then that's, how do you do that in a world where you have multiplicity of ends? But I want to read Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
This is a very forgotten essay, but it's brilliant. It's Friedman's Review of Lerner from 1947. Yeah. And the reason why I'm picking it out is you got to put the context. Again, 1947, economics, Samuelsonian economics, which is just about to start to emerge, but the economics that like Lange and Lerner and all of them were doing was an effort to have an institutionally antiseptic theory. They wanted to purge institutions from economics. And so how do I bring them back in? Again, this property, contract, and consent idea. So he starts talking here. He's quoting Lerner, and he says, and he's talking about the incentive problem. And Lerner basically says the incentive problem is not an economic problem. It's a psychological, sociological problem. Don't bring it up. When we want to talk about economics, we just talk about the efficiency properties of the mechanisms that we're in. And he says, this is Friedman, quoting Friedman, but this is only a part, and probably the least difficult part, that is the incentive issue, of the problem, as examples of competitive entrepreneurs indicate. The manager's intentions must not only be good, he must be able to translate his intentions into practice. The higher administrators, who themselves need both incentives and tests of performance, test of performance must have means of determining the extent to which the manager has been successful in his attempts to follow the rule. So he needs that profit and loss accounting, right, to tell him whether or not what they've been doing is a good way to do it or a bad way to do it. And that's what the calculation thing is, this sorting mechanism again. And his argument is that's like the crucial thing. That's Friedman, who, many years later you would just say, well, it's about private property and incentives, and then give an example of collective farms versus private plots in China or in, Russia or whatever, and say, look at the yield differences. Of course, all economists understand that idea. But the issue is like what's going on in the way this industry is organized, and the way you do that, and you need to have that sorting mechanism so that that you're not wasting resources, because we live in a world of scarcity. We didn't live in a world of scarcity, we might not have to worry about any of this stuff. But we do live in a world of scarcity, so we have to always be worried about how do we produce more with less rather than trying to produce less with more. Now, I have a paper that just came out. It's Metering, Monitoring, and Menger. And because Menger himself actually makes a similar argument that hasn't really been brought out that much about what's going on in enterprises or whatnot. And he has, I'm reading stuff into it, but he has the monitoring issue. That's the incentive issue. But he also has the metering issue. We have to be able to have that. And I think when you read like Alchin and Demsetz or any of the modern theory of the firm with both the concept of metering and monitoring in mind, you start to see the reason why what Hayek and Mises are doing. Because it's about how do I not only monitor, but how do I meter? And that's what Friedman's talking about there. And then once you get to metering, then that gets to judgment, that gets to appraisement, and that gets all the subjectivism stuff. And so this is why the Austrians are a little bit more attuned to those kind of questions, because they start already attuned to those kind of questions.
So, but speaking of Menger, I think the other debate which is relevant here is going back to the marginalists and the difference between Menger and Walras. And I think some of the present day conflation between, the computational aspect and the epistemic aspect, we can actually trace back to Menger and Walras. Because the MIT economists, and I'm just using that as a shorthand for all these computation arguments, they're accustomed to Walrasian models. And what we're really saying there is that, there are no false trades taking place. It's a mathematically modeled world of, N number of people with X goods and Y services. And all of this happens through an imaginary auctioneer who will be announcing prices like people are adjusting. And we know that there are some specific conditions, where price will equal marginal cost and output will be at the level that minimizes average cost and, all the things that you said. And we know that the output, after the auctioneer has announced everything and everyone has adjusted to everything, we're going to get the output that maximizes, production efficiency and exchange efficiency and so on, right? And this is quite different from the Mengerian tradition, which is much more focused on subjectivism and process. And to me, it seems like the problem is not that they don't know the socialist calculation debate. That's almost irrelevant at this point. It's that they are in the Walras tradition and how that developed, and not the Mengerian tradition where the entire focus is on the process, right? The outcome that you get is almost besides the point, because it's going to change in the next instant, right? There's going to be a new set of prices that everyone has to adapt to. So there's really no point studying that equilibrium point that has so beautifully come about, because it's going to change anyway.
So there's a lot there. The first thing is that it was an important discovery of Pareto and the early neoclassical economists to point out that if a socialist economy was to be rational, it would have to mimic the optimality conditions of a general competitive equilibrium. Yeah. That's just it's kind of like, think about it like math is math. So, it doesn't matter. The relationship between marginals and averages is the same as whether or not you're talking about the costs at a firm, or you're talking about the test scores of your students, or whether or not you're talking about it in India or in China or whatever. The relationship doesn't change. And so that was the idea of having a universal theory, was all tied into that. And that drove a lot, because again, what's the logic behind that? Well, here's the logic, is that economics had been debating for centuries over issues. And people thought, man, we're spinning our wheels. Now, why are we spinning our wheels? Well, we're spinning our wheels because of ambiguity. And the biggest ambiguities result from using the same words to mean different things, or different words to mean the same thing. So you know what? We're going to get rid of all that and we're going to get math. Math is math. And so then we're going to get rid of the ambiguities. Then we'll be able to have a science that's worthy of the same kind of idea. And I kid around, as you know, that what happened with Marshall when he was trying to, formalize economics as a discipline.
He said, burn the math,
Yeah.
right?
But he called it economics.
Yeah.
And everyone before that was political economy. Political economy, that means you end up with all the other disciplines that end up in Y, which is like history, philosophy, sociology, right? But if you end in an X, you're with the cool crowd, right? You're with physics, you're with mechanics, you're with, right? And so who wants to not be, one of my teachers was the great Kenneth Boulding. Yeah. And I asked Boulding, when I was a student, I said, Professor Boulding, why is it that everyone became a logical positivist? And he laughed and he said, oh, my dear Peter, he goes, who would want to be an illogical negativist? and his point was a very good one about like capturing words and where you belong on things. And I think using economics was kind of important because it put us as a hard science, which was an aspiration. So we're not soft science like these other ones. We're not squishy over there. We're a hard science. And what makes us a hard science eventually is going to be that we can follow the rules just like in physics. And we can develop these hypotheses generated out of our formal models, and then we can test them. And I think one of the things that was a really big methodological issue, this is why Hayek goes off on the methodological idea, is that for most of the history of economics, what we cared about was having a logically sound theory, which means that if your premises are true and your deductions are correct, then your conclusions are in fact true, right? And so this is how you would have a truth-preserving idea. But that's really tough stuff. And that has all. So what happened with math is you don't have truth-preserving. What you have is internal coherence of a validity. You have validity, not, this soundness. And so what we did was we traded off the difficult stress for soundness and embraced validity as our goal. But the idea is that, and this is why it took a while for it to take off and why it correlates with the rise of mathematics, because we've been trying to do math for a while, but it really takes off once we get statistical tools, because the belief is now we could have an array of logically valid models, but we're going to sort among them, right, by finding out which ones are empirically meaningful by having these very good statistical tests. The problem, of course, is that even in physics, the Duhem-Quine thesis says that, that even these statistical tests are not going to unambiguously tell us which of the theories are right. And so then we get stuck with a variety of these toy economy models, which seem so divorced from the world that we're trying to study. But that's a long story, and it's more complicated than that. But that's connected up to why it is that you can get these kind of models that you're talking about. But I think the really important point that you made about Walras versus Menger is that by definition, the approach of the general equilibrium and partial equilibrium approach, which builds on a system of simultaneous equations, as solving of a system of simultaneous equations, whether or not it's comparative statics or whether or not it's a general equilibrium idea, it relies on not articulating the process. So first, system of simultaneous equations, you have pre-reconciliation of plans, and then you have a P and Q vector that clears the market, and you know what that result is. And as you said, you get simultaneously exchange efficiency, production efficiency, and product mix efficiency, right? You get those things simultaneously achieved. In comparative statics, what you do is you have an equilibrium, you have an exogenous shock, and you have a new equilibrium. Yeah. You don't have any kind of process by which it goes there. Now, when you're telling the story in your class, you might talk about buying low and selling high, or when you talk about, Marshall's fish market, you talk about this fish, and as the fish start to get old, the price goes down, you get rid of them faster. That's your appreciative theory that you're telling, but it's not in the actual formula that's there. The formula is either a system of clearing a vector or a change and then another vector. So one vector that's at equilibrium, a shock, then another vector like that, all of which preclude process analysis. This has huge implications. One of the things about the Austrians is they begin in their understanding of the market is one in which you begin as a monopolist. And what happens is your monopoly power gets eroded by the entrance of other traders. So, but you're the first mover in a market. So I'm the first person to come up with, bottled water. And then, for a while there, I get monopoly rents for the bottled water. And then the next person says, they're making pretty good money. They get lured by the profit opportunity, and then they come in, and then they erode that market share. So the market becomes competitive. Yeah. It doesn't ever start as competitive. It becomes more and more competitive. And so the whole thing about the Austrians is, and not just the Austrians, but Buchanan and everything, is that the order is defined in the process of its own emergence. Yeah. And so as that is happening, there's all kinds of new generation of knowledge. There's new evolution of product quality characteristics, all kinds of various things that make for our life, as consumers. And it's constantly shifting and changing, as you said. And so this is where the system of simultaneous equations, which is a very determinate system, it doesn't allow us to talk about these other kinds of things. And there's a very logical reason why they got rid of entrepreneurship. So for years, entrepreneurship was one of the key things, right? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, right? All classical economists talked about that.
And then we called it the residual claimant, like the thing that's left over that we can't exactly put into our...
And we get rid of it. And so, Schumpeter has to bring it back. Baumol and Kerzner have to bring it back. And it's not there, right? And so, Baumol even referred to it as, what economics is like Hamlet without the prince, right? And so because it's the entrepreneur that's driving all of the things and the innovation machine. But with losing the entrepreneur, we also lose innovation, except as an exogenous shock. And so that's why all of the evolution of post-1950 economics is a rediscovery in a lot of ways of a lot of the earlier... what was lost in economics. And I think that, that relates to, why it is that we get sucked into these different puzzles.
I think it's also got to do with the idea of perfect competition, right? So if we look at stuff, say, late 19th century, early 20th century, it's a competitive process. They will say, dynamic market process or something like that. This idea of competition was always there, or contestability. Yeah. But perfect competition, if I'm not wrong, is sort of Frank Knight's innovation, right? This is like, I think he uses the phrase, but he uses the phrase to kind of, show pedagogically, show something, right? And squeaks in all these assumptions that if all these assumptions were true, then you would get what we have and what we call perfect competition, right? And now, with the whole Marshall demand and supply curve and how analytically easy and tractable and, it's got such great explanatory value in the classroom, you add these two things together and then it becomes some kind of normative idea that we want that, right? That's the thing the planners want. That's the thing that the, FTC wants. And now the entire question is, how do we get to that as if an individual can calculate up to that point without all the things that are required to either have some kind of competitive process which mimics that, or, some kind of contestability process which will mimic that. So we've erred on both sides, which is if we don't have exactly that, it's not proper market competition. And if we don't have anything else and we just have that, that's enough to get us our simultaneous equations and calculate everything else that we need, right?
So, I think it's very important to keep in mind a point that you just made, which is that what Lange and Lerner did, I mentioned earlier about the formal similarity issue. What happens is they confuse the formal similarity issue with a solution.
Yeah.
So if we could demonstrate that there's a formal similarity, then why not just make the socialist regime or the collectivist economy, that's what they normally called it, collectivist economy, why don't we just make it do exactly the same rules that would be in a competitive market economy, except that we don't use the competitive market, we use the planning bureaucracy to do it. And you're right about the role of perfect competition and all of that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that thinkers like Knight, like Mises and Hayek, like Ronald Coase, what they did was they were working with a foil concept of equilibrium to identify the world that isn't the world that they were doing, because the world out the window is too complex. Yeah. So they need to frame the world of change by isolating what a world without change would look like. So in a world without change, in equilibrium, you have no firms, you have actually really no markets, you actually end up by having no law or anything like that. The institutions don't matter. And so what happens, for example, Hayek, in the debate with Keynes, says, look, you want to explain unemployment, you got to begin in a world of full employment, before, so identify what a world of full employment looked like. Now tell me what gave rise to unemployment. Now I know a cause for unemployment. I can't start with a world of unemployment and then say, oh, now fix it, which is what the Keynesian sort of idea did. That's the logic behind why Hayek argues that Keynes is dealing with a world of abundance, because there's no trade-offs in this. It's just a technical solution. So Knight wanted to understand the phenomena of profit.
Yeah.
It was he comes out of studying theology. He's very philosophical. He's very fascinated by the idea of profit. Can we justify profits?
Yeah.
And so the way in which he's trying to examine that and risk, uncertainty, and profit is he wants to start, what would a world look like in which there was no profit at all? And so his argument is that profit is not super, rates of return are not due to risk.
Yeah.
Because, risk is just, that would be manageable. And, so that's just another kind of return. But what it is the bearing for uncertainty, right? And so, but
we don't know what we don't know.
Right. And that's what he wants to get to.
And that's what you're rewarded for.
So the joke is always that the Chicago guys read the first couple chapters, but didn't read the other chapters, right? That's just facetious, or whatever. But I think that one of the things that's crucial about, and COAS, zero transaction cost world, but he never wanted to study the zero transaction cost world. He wants to study, in fact, in his book, summarizing his points of view, which is before his Nobel Prize, it's called The Firm, the Market, and the Law, right? And he goes through and explains it. I really recommend all your listeners to read that book, because he also, in that, identifies why he got the idea from the socialist calculation debate, which is him, again, thinking about this issue of metering and monitoring, or what he would call transaction costs later on, and everything like that. So what you have is a fascinating evolution of modern economics, which is you have these early masters of neoclassical economics using a FOIL model.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have people using it as a benchmark, what you just said.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have people using it as an as if, right? And so it's like, oh, it's as if. And so this issue of where the Friedman in 47, the difference between that Friedman and the evolution of Friedman or Stigler is that by the time you get to their more like mature statements, what they're trying to stress is not so much the generative process of the market discovering things, though they are not ignorant of that. One of my favorite stories is Stigler in his Memoirs of an Unregulated Economist. People should look this up. There's a story where Koopmans comes to him in outrage because he says, George, I heard that you argued that we should use the price system in the case of evacuating New York City in the case of a bombing. And Stigler writes back to him and says, well, Tollings, you need not worry. No, I did not write that kind of memo. But on second thought, and then he goes and explains why the market system would be more adaptable and adjustable and all these things like that to the moment on the time of the bombing, which is very brilliant. It's just great. It's Stigler to a T because he's so, snarky in a lot of ways.
But it's happening today. Like when there is a disaster situation, the Uber price surge just goes through the roof.
Right.
And you do see the market mechanism in some way allocating scarce resources for people who want to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
That's what makes people mad.
Yeah, I get that.
Right?
That's the normative thing.
Exactly. That's the normative thing. Yeah.
So you have that. So, but what happened in economics is the debate forgot the FOIL.
Yeah.
And it just became a debate between the benchmark and the as if.
Yeah.
And this debate has huge implications for us because it affects the whole Econ 101 debate, which is like, and then you have on the outside the FOIL people, which also includes someone like Buchanan, who is sitting there saying in 2009, 2010, hey, there's an old Chicago tradition which actually cared about institutions. Yeah. And so what are you talking about? And so he contrasts the old Chicago with the new Chicago. Yeah. And then he has this whole thing about the emperor has no clothes. Yeah. And, which people dismissed as an old man being cranky. But the reality is those papers are brilliant that he, is identifying because he's talking about this Knightian tradition of where you have your economic system is embedded. I'll give you an example of this. It's in the Economic Organization, in which Knight actually uses the argument that the theorems of economics are like the skeleton. Yeah. Okay? And the institutions are like the muscles and the ligaments and everything like that. So a skeleton, just a pure skeleton, can't actually make your arm move. Yeah. Right? You need to have all the muscles to be able to do it. On the other hand, if you had just the muscles and no skeleton, your arm would, I'm somewhat silly in my teaching. And so there's a scene in one of the early Harry Potters where Harry's learning to play Quidditch. Yeah. And he falls off of his stick or whatever,
Broom.
a broom, and breaks his arm.
Yeah.
And there's this weird wizard, and the wizard says, "I can fix your arm," and then he takes all the bones out of his arm. And so, to me, that's what happens in economics when we don't have theory, right? So we don't have theory; we just have data analysis. It's just this blobby flesh. But on the other hand, if we just had the skeleton, we lose all the interesting details about what makes the system function. And so this is like the way Kerzner uses the analogy. I know I'm mixing up a bunch of analogy, but Kerzner uses the analogy of it's the friction between the soles of my feet and the ground that allows me to walk. If there was no friction, I'd slide and fall all over the place. And it's the frictions in the economy, the ligaments and the muscles that make economic life come alive for us, as opposed to just the skeleton. But we need that skeleton. Going back to Hayek 37, the skeleton is a pure logic of choice. Yeah. The muscles and ligaments are the institutional analysis. The outcome is how do I take the two of them together to then explain the functioning of the body economics. Knight had that all in him, right? But a lot of people just focus on the bones, right? Yeah. So, and they miss this other part. And I think that's because they confuse the foil. They just focus on the as if. Yeah. They compare the as if to that. And so think about our economics profession. You have Bob Lucas, who just passed away, brilliant economist, right? And then you have Joe Stiglitz. And both of them are what you would call mainstream economists. They taught at the best universities. They won the Nobel Prize. They're super cited and everything like that. And here they are. They're contrasted with one another. Stiglitz is all about the benchmark, and it fails. The market constantly fails. He's never met a market that didn't fail. And Lucas never met a market that wasn't perfect because he doesn't actually have to have it be perfect. It's an as if, right? And to go even further, if you go to Becker's Foundations, when you read Becker's, his foundational book on the economic approach to human behavior, note what he says. He says these are assumptions that you have maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and basically competitive equilibrium. Price has to equal marginal cost. So it's not that he discovers price equal to marginal cost. It's in a condition I impose on the world. Yeah. So he makes sense of the senseless by imposing that order on the world. It's brilliant, but Stiglitz does the same thing by imposing, okay, you say that, but I'm going to say that individuals suffer weakness of will, and they're also going to suffer from monopoly structures. Lo and behold, the price system doesn't work. And so it fails on every occasion, right? And so this is the debate we have. Market never works, market always works. And I know that people don't like this. Kerzner has made a living out doing this, but he always says, look, I'm in the middle ground, right? I'm in between these two things. So I have, the real world is constantly filled with change and whatnot, which means that there's surpluses and unexploited opportunities all the time that need to be discovered and exploited, which means I'm in market failure at some level.
Or disequilibrium, at the very least.
But I'm in the process of becoming. On the other hand, the market never have a problem. So the market has a solution as opposed to saying it has no solution. Government has to be a deus machina. Or the market never has a problem, therefore we just rely on the market. Instead, there's this middle ground, which is the institutional and entrepreneurial innovations. If I could just say one thing about that, which I think is interesting for development economics, for all kinds of different things like that, and the big debate. There's a great paper by Deirdre McCloskey on the 126 market failures. Do you know this paper I'm talking about? So McCloskey goes through all these different things and identifies all the market failures that people have identified in textbooks, which I find always amazing because when you hear the neoliberal Econ 101 criticism, they say, oh, market fundamentalism is taught. And I'm like, I don't know any market fundamentalists are teaching at Harvard or whatever. What they do is they teach, basically supply and demand. And then the next lecture is monopoly, externalities, public goods, macroeconomic instability, inequality. And they spend the rest of the semester on government as a corrective to the social ills that they've identified. Yeah. So McCloskey has this whole list of these market failures that she's identified. And what I think is really weird about that is, okay, so what's the response? So the as-if response, which is the majority of very skilled market economists do, they follow more of the Chicago approach. To me, I think there's something a little bit wrong with that because it's like a Jedi mind trick. There are no externalities, right? There is no monopoly problem. Now, they do it sophisticatedly sometimes. Like, so for example, in the old structure, conduct, performance paradigm, the Chicago New Learning was like, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to look at automobiles produced just in the United States, by just United States auto producers. I'm going to look at the global market. And if I define the market broadly enough, no one's a monopolist, right? If I define the market narrowly enough, everyone's a monopolist. So I'm going to define the market very broadly, and then I have the broad market. And so therefore your monopoly criticisms aren't true or whatever. And I'm not saying that, and also identifying various costs. So, one of my favorite arguments that Alchin and others made was, oh, show me a normal monopoly, diagram. And then you say, why can't the monopolist perfectly price discriminate? And your answer is the monopolist can't perfectly price discriminate because of transaction costs. And then you go, transaction costs. That's an additional cost to engage in an additional exchange. That, another word for that is called marginal cost. So that marginal cost curve that you have that's horizontal, we're drawing it wrong. We have to let it go tick, 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 tick. And then all of a sudden, price equals marginal costs given those contexts. Okay, but there's something about that which is cheeky to us as economists, but it's like a Jedi mind trick to the Stiglitz of the world. So Stiglitz writes in his book, With or Socialism, Chicago economics was well-funded but not well-founded, because he doesn't want to have the Jedi mind trick.
Yeah.
To me, I think, what a better answer if we rely on Coase and Buchanan and Kerzner. Because what we're going to have is, first, the possibility of different changes in the institutions, which will, in fact, be Pareto improvements. So we can do them in changes of the law, right, which is what, so in the Coasean framework, right, what you do is you allow people to negotiate. If they can't negotiate away the conflict, you adjudicate to clarify the rights so they can negotiate. The priority is to get them to negotiate away the conflicts. And the legal changes are, in fact, to clarify the situation so they can negotiate away their conflicts. In Buchanan's idea, it's you propose structural rule changes so that you can realize Pareto improvements. Now, that has to be tested against the collective action decision-making. So your hypothesis as an economist is not taken as, godlike or whatever. It's tested in the collective process of democratic decision-making. But nevertheless, you can get Pareto improvements by changes in the rules. Eleanor Ostrom, changes in the rules, but from the ground up. Buchanan more from the top down, her more from the bottom up. Again, institutional. So there's an institutional answer to these very hairy social problems. On the other hand, you have Kerzner and Baumol and Schumpeter and other ones who sit there and say, today's inefficiency is tomorrow's profit opportunity for the person who can solve that problem. And so they'll jump in to try to arbitrage that way or come up with a new technological innovation to be able to achieve that. And so how robust is that answer to the market? I'm saying it to you, and you're nodding your head because you buy this. It dumbfounds me that this is not like the standard economics response. So during the pandemic, I read Matt Ridley's book, How Innovation Works. He has a line in there that I love. Of course, Deirdre's been saying this same argument, but Ridley summarizes up, says, innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. Yeah. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, so that obviously seems true. So why is it that not everyone just says, there we go? So what we need is to have a permissionless, economy that allows for constant entrepreneurial innovation to be able to achieve these, greater outcomes than any of us ever could imagine for them to discover. And to me, I think that's why aren't we teaching that in economics? And so part of the difficulty with this is outside of this debate, but the broader difficulty of the critique of economics, the economist hour is up and all these other kind of things like that, is that I think the critics have misidentified what it is that the sin in economics is. The sin in economics isn't market fundamentalism, because there are no market fundamentalists. The sin in economics is that we teach it as if it was social engineering.
Yeah.
And we forgot that economics, in its best, is a tool for the curious. It's to excite the minds of the young people, not by giving them a catechism or telling them what to think, but to tell them how to actually frame questions when they look out the window, to allow them to have observational genius about making sense out of the senseless that's all around them, making a mystery out of the mundane. This is what Adam Smith's doing with the common woolen coat. Common woolen coat, what's so mysterious about that? And then Smith says, look at that thing. Where the hell did it come from? And then starts talking, 200 years later, Leonard Read says, a pencil. So it's the same kind of thing, right? Yeah. And goes through it. We could say today, an iPhone, how do we get that? And so once we do those kind of things, make the mystery of the mundane, or, allow us to make sense out of the senseless behavior that we see out in the world, then all of a sudden, we can see that economics is this tool for the curious to help them reason through. It's a golden key, and we shouldn't hoard it. And we should be really excited as teachers to share the golden key with people, to recognize that we live in a world of scarcity, that scarcity implies trade-offs. Trade-offs mean that we must negotiate those trade-offs. In order to negotiate those trade-offs, we need aids to the human mind. The commercial society gives us those aids in the terms of property prices and profit and loss. If we're not in a commercial society, give me another aid to the human mind. And it turns out when we do the comparative institutions of those different institutions, they don't do as well. And so as a result, we get stuck making trade-offs that are not going to be corrected and redirected whenever we make mistakes. We get mistakes are embedded into the system, and privileges are embedded into the system. And again, like you mentioned earlier, like one of the ways in which, we did answer these questions in the past was caste. What does caste do? Caste actually locks, right, the world in. And so when we think about those kind of ideas, it makes us really think about the dynamic nature of markets, and why don't we teach markets that way, as exchange, the institutions within which exchange takes place, and the entrepreneurial activity that drives economic progress.
So, when you were talking about the as if, right, in Hayek's 1945 paper, that's an important part of the argument, right? Knowledge is dispersed and it's incomplete, and no one has this perfect information or perfect knowledge that we're talking about.
That's the 10 example.
Yeah, but people are able to behave as if they knew everything just by following the price signal, because the price, incidentally, has managed to assimilate all the dispersed information and knowledge out there. It's managed to accommodate everyone's subjective choices and produce a lovely signal, right? That can tell you something about the world and make you act. It can also incentivize you to act as if you have that knowledge. Now, I want to come back to the socialist calculation debate, because I think it can inform this whole AI question. Because what Oscar Lange and Abba Lerner and Fred Taylor and all these guys did, actually, they weren't very socialist in the Marxist sense. They were very socialist in the marginalist sense, right? I would call them like Walrasian socialists, if that makes any kind of sense. I don't think anyone has used that weird phrase. But what I mean is, they thought that, there are these numbers out there. We have some kind of ranking that we can get in these markets outside. We can just borrow all of that, right? And then we can feed that into a computer, and that computer is going to tell us something. And what they forgot is that those numbers only tell us as if, right? What was happening was actually happening, and everyone knew what they were doing, but they don't actually tell us that, because you've removed that context. So can you walk me through what that debate was? And then, we can talk about how that feeds into the computation question, which is in your techno-socialism paper.
So let me start by pointing to your first issue, is that the reason why Hayek was so animated in the discussion was because he thought that his liberal friends were making the same mistake that the German audience made a generation earlier. Now, the British at the time that they were writing, the market socialists, their argument, this is like Dickinson, Durbin, Lerner, Lange counts, even though he's Polish, but he's in London at the time that he's doing this. They think that they are socialists in their economics because they're liberal in their politics. Going back to techno-socialism, they now like to call this cybernetics, socialism. It never got implemented. It just was like a plan that they were going to do, but we'll come back to that in a second. So they thought that they needed to be collectivist in their economics precisely because they wanted to be liberal in their politics.
Yeah.
So part of the main thing of the road to serfdom was to show, time out, guys, you can't be a collectivist and a Democrat. Your goals of your collectivism will squash your democratic virtues, and that's a tragedy. And that's why, so Hayek's dedication of that book to socialists of all parties is not a flippant comment. It's a sincere comment. And his whole point is the road to serfdom is a road to tragedy. Yeah. You could have called it the tragic road, right, of intellectual path. And he even says in there, what could be worse than people with high ideals end up by creating hell on earth, by pursuing their high ideals. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now, the second thing is that, so they want to get rid of the monopoly problem. They want to address the business cycle problem, and they want to address the social problem of inequality. Think about the Beveridge Report, right? So the Beveridge Report has the 5 giants. I don't know if you've ever seen the propaganda ad. It has government, which is like a tiny midget, and then it has the five giants. And the government with the Beveridge report is slashing the five giants. And the five giants are, poverty, ignorance, squalor, disease, and idleness. So they're going to use these programs to slash this. And, that's 1942 that program comes in. But between the 1930s and the 1940s, the Labor Party's trying to, push through this agenda to address, again, they're in the midst of the Great Depression, right? They haven't really gotten out of that. They're just about to enter into a war. And they're very optimistic that they could actually do things the right way. And then that, of course, all comes into an issue. And they knew they couldn't go the full Marxist way. They knew that even going back. Remember, the LSE is a Fabian school, and so they try to use marginalist principles. But they believed in socialist competition. So that's like in the Edward Bellamy book, Looking Backward, where, and the argument was very simple. It's like, look, if my firm, a socialist firm, only has the price equal to cost, not price equal to cost plus markup for profit, then I'm going to outcompete in the competitive marketplace. They're going to go to the restaurant that sells the burger for $3 rather than for $5, right? And so in the end, we'll wake up one day and everyone will be in the future socialist world. And, they had those kind of ideas. And they'll address, and they thought distribution, again, think about all the issues that are involved. They think distribution is a question of politics, not a question of economics. So they're like millions, right? Where the laws of production are different from the laws of distribution. Part of the whole thing about the marginalist revolution was to say, no, the size of the pie is a function of how it is you slice up the pie. And so you can't have production and distribution. Wade Buchanan used to say to it in the class was that you basically, you can't separate out the rules. You can't just pick and choose whatever distributions you want. You have to actually pick rules of the game, which engender a pattern of exchange, production, and distribution. And so this lesson had to be learned. And these are all part of things Hayek is trying to get across in The Road to Serfdom, and then eventually in The Constitution of Liberty, as he addresses the move from hot socialism to cold socialism, right? And so, all right, now, the arguments at that time were using the greatest technology that they had available to them, which was a professionalized bureaucracy that could follow the rules that were given to them by the neoclassical model of market socialism. All right. So they didn't have advanced computing yet, like we know of, right? In fact, even if you look at NASA or whatever, the computers, when we first were in the space program, were individuals. That's what they were called, the computing department. And they were people with their slide rulers and doing all the math calculations. And so, the modern computing technology gets developed. And one of the things that it can do is it can produce given algorithms very, very quickly. And so that became a mode of optimism, that as long as you're dealing with algorithms, can we just turn society into an algorithm? And when we do that, and if I treat data as given, it does seem to me that, algorithms work. Now, Hayek is quite explicit that the data is never given, but they don't read that part, right?
That's the as if.
Yeah. And so that's not the part that they focus on. They focus on the idea that the price, all I have to know is what the price of tin does. And then I can infer from that whether or not, all the rest, I can act appropriately on that. So itself is kind of a grand telecommunication system, which in some sense is an algorithm, right? And so when Hayek responds, which is actually before the use of knowledge in society paper, in like the competitive solution, he argues that, look, what everyone's forgetting is that you have to discover anew each day what is the least cost technology to employ. And if you don't discover it, the guy next to you is going to discover it and bring it in and compete you away. And so it's very contestable, as you were mentioning before, and all these things. And it's this generative process that's getting completely lost. When I show up to graduate school, I'm excited about this debate. And Don Lavoie, my professor, was working on these issues. And so I wanted to go study with Lavoie. I decided, through various different process of search, I'd get into Mort Mason, and I decided I'm going to come here to do it. And I end up by working for Lavoie. Do you know what the very first thing he gave me to read? It wasn't Mises, it wasn't Hayek, it wasn't Michael Polanyi, which, eventually he does. It was Herbert Dreyfus's What Computers Can't Do. Oh, and I think it's important. I have a new paper out on SSRN. It's going to come out in the Independent Review. It's an appreciation of Lavoie And I hope people read it. The paper on SSRN is much larger than the one that will actually be published. But Lavoie was a professional computer programmer and actually quite talented computer programmer. He eventually, at the back end of his career, went back to computer simulations and programming. But he gave us the Herbert Dreyfus book on what computers can't do. And then we also had to read like the debate between like Searle and other people, John Searle, the philosopher, on what AI could do and all these things like that. You know, I'm reading this stuff and I'm like, what the heck why am I doing this when I'm supposed to be learning, microeconomics and macroeconomics and everything? But he had a reason for that, which is he wanted to understand what the nature of the knowledge is, of human knowledge is in the market. Because again, go back to our earlier idea, if markets are about judgments of judgments and appraisement, these are very human characteristics that computers don't have. It's that the world isn't in an algorithm. We have to actually, decide between algorithms or which algorithms we need to modify through combinatorial thinking. And so it goes back again to social learning. And I think that's the key thing. And Acemoglu, in the more recent Twitter thing, he has some papers on social learning. So when you reframe it in terms of social learning, he's like, is that what Hayek's arguing? If that's what Hayek's arguing, that's pretty cool, right? But that's not how I read Hayek, right? That's what he said, is basically saying. But I could see how you could read Hayek that way. And if that's cool, then, that's cool. That's a different kind of argument. Let's talk about that. And so I think, he's a brilliant, he's probably the it factor economist in the world today. And so, it's pretty cool that he's actually thinking about these kind of issues or whatever. But I like to think in terms of this social epistemology distinction between what they call wicked learning environments and kind learning environments. And in our techno-socialism paper, we talk a little bit about this. In kind learning environments, the parameters are fixed. Yeah. So it's more analogous to chess. So the game of chess is fixed. There's very strict rules, right? So, a bishop can only move so many ways. Right? A rook can only move so many ways, right? They're very defined rules, and there's only so many spots on the board, okay? And therefore, what a computer can do is it can process the algorithms and get through those pretty quickly. But if you try to make a computer play a game in which the parameters are relatively free, so if you think about going back to Lavoie was able to get a computer to play Bach, but he couldn't get a computer to play Miles Davis. Yeah. All right. There's a difference there. Or John Coltrane. Right. There's a kind of a difference. And I think we can get computers to play Kasparov, but we can't get them to be Ronaldo. Right. And the reason is that Ronaldo is constantly dealing with a spin of a ball and the way it comes to him in ways that require him constantly to be agile, adapt, readapt, and constantly adjust. And the question you have to ask is an entrepreneur more like Kasparov in seeking out a chess move, or is it more like, Ronaldo trying to adjust and adapt? You and I both love tennis, right? Roger Federer, one of the things that was amazing about him was his ability to come up with amazing shots in the most improbable things, especially in his prime. He just did like amazing things. He reintroduced the squash shot in the major tennis, right? That he would pull off. He was the one that did the between the legs, before everyone else was doing. He mastered it, right? I was just watching the match the other day with Alcaraz, versus Tsitsipas, and for the first 9/10 of that match, Alcaraz was on a whole other level. And if you look at the shot making that he was doing, it was like off the charts, and it was all him doing like various different variations that required constant adaptation and adjustment to whatever this other guy threw. The number 5 player in the world, all right, number 5 player in the world playing the number 1 player in the world, and he's about to take him out at one of the Grand Slams in less than 3 games that the guy had at the time, right? He was just blowing him out, and you're watching it and you're like in awe because of this adaptation and adjustment. So if I go to MIT's Creative Lab and I watch their robots play soccer, it doesn't look too good. If I watch them play, they can have a dog that jumps from, an already known angle, right? So think about it. Like, they have this dog that's going to race, right? So it's going to race, your dogs or whatever. And they have it already known that it's going to land on a surface that's tilted this way or tilted that way. And they program that in because they program in what they already know, what the future is going to hold. And then, of course, the robot can adapt and adjust. But that's the fixed algorithm. Yeah. Imagine if what was happening was like what Marshall puts out in the Principles book, which is that it's not just the pendulum. Remember what he says about the market system? He goes, you have a pendulum and it swings. He says, but now imagine that pendulum is in a sort of turbulent sea of water. And that's what commercial life is like.
Yeah.
Now, we don't know where the pendulum's going to go because the turbulent seas are pulling it all the way. And the individual that's the judge on the spot, the man on the spot, Hayek's man on the spot, is going to have to make those judgments and appraisements constantly to be able to actually move the market in a certain way. So I think this is, that's not going to be fixed by better and better computers. That requires human intelligence. And this goes back to the Searle point, right? In the Chinese, box and language box, there's a difference between syntactic knowledge and semantic knowledge, meaning of terms and understanding everything like that. And we as humans, we rely on all those kind of various things in our appraisements and our judgments, and our computers don't have those kind of things. Now, these tools can be extremely good tools. I'm trying to go in a course of self-improvement myself right now. And I have a tool on this thing, and I track everything that I do, and it follows me, and it can do all the things, and I love it, and everything like that. And I use it all the time, and I can try to organize things like that. But it's still my judgment when I sit down at a restaurant to decide whether I'm going to have a piece of bread or stay gluten-free, right? Or whatever, right? And so I have to actually act on that judgment in those appraisements. And I think that human element of us is what makes our economic life so fascinating.
Yeah. It's funny you say about the judgment thing. People typically think that I'm a snob because I won't eat Hershey's chocolate or something like that. And what I constantly tell them is it's not worth being fat for. Right? So I'm not getting fat eating that chocolate. I'm going to get fat eating a far superior chocolate. So I'm willing to do it, but this is not worth it. And that is. And for some people, Hershey's chocolate might do the trick, right? In some other cases.
It's funny that you say that, because now that I'm tracking all these things, one of the things that I say to my wife, Rosemary, all the time is we'll pick a food, and I'll discover how many calories it's worth. And I'm like, that's not worth that. that I make exactly your argument. I'm like, that's not worth it. That extra banana doesn't, that's a lot. That's 100 calories. Maybe that's, I could have something else for that, But to go back, there's a really good paper. I hope I don't butcher his name. He's at University of Pennsylvania. His name is Jesus Fernandez Villaverdi.
Yes.
And he has a great paper that's on a public domain. It's not like a journal article at the moment on why AI doesn't solve the knowledge problem. But he's working on developing a paper, a more full-blown paper of these arguments.
And he has a paper on AI, but he did for one of my edited volumes in the International Review of Law and Economics.
Yes.
But that had to do with the complexity of the world. So this was Richard Epstein's Simple Rules for a Complex World and how AI can't solve the computation problem.
Yeah. So he's got his finger on the pulse of this, and he's a very successful, economist, and he can talk to these guys on their terms and stuff. And so I'm very hopeful that he'll be able to communicate a lot of ideas to economists, that we should be paying attention to how he's developing these arguments and learn from him on that. I'm very hopeful. Of course, I'm not, dogmatic about it. Who knows, I might, in the future, we might have computers that become fully human or something, right?
So
and we might have singularity moment,
So I recently saw the Apple Vision Pro launch, right? And one of the things that I learned was that it uses some kind of subliminal messages to figure out what you're going to move next, or almost predict how you're going to twitch and move and what you want to see. So it's figured out some part of this cognitive function in a predictive way, right? We also have neural links. We have all this brain mapping stuff. What would it take to not just solve the computation problem, which is just a question of computing power and how much we throw at it, but this aspect of the tacit knowledge, right? And the knowledge that is not institutionally antiseptic, and it's subjective, and it comes from the individual and their judgment. But what would it take to be able to predict that, such that as if we could solve the calculation problem? What would that look like?
So, Smith long ago ties a lot to language and our ability to engage in what communication is. And I think communication is a lot more than, say information theory had it, which is signal to noise ratio, and there's a sender and a receiver, and all that kind of stuff like that. There's a lot more subliminal things to this. There's a book. It's a weird book. It's by a guy named Dan Rose. He was an anthropologist at University of Pennsylvania. He was a student of Irving Goffman's, and it's a Russell Sage volume. It's called Living the Radical Ethnographic Life. And I met him when I was a fellow at Boston University at Peter Berger's Institute for the Study of Economic Culture, like years and years ago. And he was a fascinating guy. He I'll tell you just a very quick story about him. He wrote a book which made his career. It's called Black American Street Life. And as a Goffman student, he went and he lived in the South Central Philly and tried to like blend in and do these, his notes, and it became a bestseller and everything like that. And then after that, he's at Penn, right? So what he decided to do was write a book. He wrote that book in 6 years, okay? The next 20 years of his career was in the process of writing a book about living the lifestyle on the mainline outside. So he was belonged to cricket clubs and things like that. And when he first did the presentation, I was sitting there and I was like, can you tell me how you got those research grants? Because I want to sign up for that deep ethnographic, divide. But anyway, he's a fascinating guy. I love talking to him and I learned so much about him. But one of the things that was fascinating is he pointed out the following thing. He goes, when we do most anthropology, a kid goes to college and decides that they want to study, say, the Balinese and cockfight, right? And so then what they do is they start learning the language. And they learn the language when they're 19 years old. And then they study it when they're 19, 20, 21, 22. They go to graduate school, right? They think they know the language. They do field work and things like that. And then they write their dissertation. He says, how long have they known the language, right? They've known the language and lived in that community for a total maybe of like 6 or 7 years. He goes, would we rely on the reports of a 7-year-old to tell us about this community that they're living in, right? No, right? We wouldn't. And that's because so much of the human experience is tied up into the subtleties of language. Yeah. And that's the key issue, I think. Yeah. So if we go back and we look at, what Smith was arguing about in terms of language, or what McCloskey's arguing about in terms of language and the way we communicate, and the unspoken spoken, right? Yeah. What Hayek calls their tacit presuppositions, right? These kind of things. And I think that we would have to somehow be able to render not useful, but explicit these tacit understandings. And if we could do that, then the judgments could be algorithms rather than these judgment calls that are made. And the other thing is that I do understand that when I use the phrase combinatorial, that it does suggest computation, but there is something weird about combinatorials that are unique to people. So
context.
Yeah, it's context.
Right?
So here's an interesting story. It's outside of economics. I heard it on NPR. I have no idea how robust like this is, but it was Yo-Yo Ma. So one of the things Yo-Yo Ma has decided to do since he's very successful is he gathers every year musicians from all over the world. He'll find like the best bagpipe player, and then he'll find the best person like that, and they meet in this compound and they try to like come up with music with all these various different, instruments or whatever, who no one would normally put together. So when I was a graduate student, I read this fantastic article about what was found on Jacob Weiner's desk when he died. Jacob Weiner died, and they had to clear out his desk. And so Jacob Weiner had this habit that he had developed all over the years, in which every Friday he went to the library. He didn't do any other thing at the library, but he took notes on the journals. Now, the journals weren't as big as they are now, but what he did was he'd start with Journal A, and then for the next quarter, he'd be reading every Friday until he got to Journal Z. Yeah. And then the quarter would be up, so then he'd be back at A again. And he took notes on all the articles he found of interest, but he didn't know that the articles existed until he picked out the journal. So instead, what we do now when we have a search engine is we know, oh, Hayek wrote that paper in 1937. Where can I find it on JSTOR, right? Shruti Rajagopalan has this paper. How can I find that on JSTOR, right? And then we've got it. And it's amazing. I do this, and then an article appears in front of me. But what I don't do is I don't get all the other articles that were in the International Review of Law and Economics or in the JLS that are in the same issue as you. I get your article, right? And so I don't get the serendipity of like, oh, I'm looking at Shruti's article, but wow, look at that other article. I might, that might be really cool. Let me look at that. And I think part of what science, the discovery of science, is these motions of these aha serendipity moments where I sit there and I think, that guy did that, and that gal did that, and I'm going to take that and combine them, and I'm going to do this. And that's where you come up with a new sort of idea. There's no necessary algorithm that would ever link those two together. That's this human judgment, this human appraisement of how I'm going to try it. And a large part of them fail. Going back to invoking Boulding again, one of the things Boulding used to say to us in class all the time is, economic science would make more progress if we published people's wastebaskets, right? Because, you try acts of creativity and they fail. The 20th century had a shift in the way we conceived of the scientist in economics and the discipline of economics. Yeah. And I think we used to do economics from the inside out. And then what happens, we ended up by doing economics from the outside in. And when you do economics from the inside out, you put priority on the clever and creativity of the actors in the economy that you're studying. When you do economics from the outside in, you put the creative and cleverness of the theorist who's trying to control the economy. Okay.
Because everyone's a representative agent, right?
Exactly.
That's what we do.
Yeah. And so this makes a huge, for example, think about the difference between Hayek's knowledge problem and Lucas's knowledge critique, right? In the critique of Keynes. So what Lucas argues in his critique of Keynes is that no agent in the economy doesn't know what the economic theorist knows. Hayek's argument is subtly different. Hayek's argument is that no economic theorist can know what the agent in the economy knows, because the agent in the economy has that knowledge of time and place, which the theorist doesn't have. They only have this general knowledge, what he calls the difference between, knowledge in a system versus knowledge between systems, right? And so there's this subtle distinction, I think, that matters when we practice economics from the inside out. So let me give you another example.
But I do think Lucas's models are also doing the foil thing, which we often miss.
Yeah,
right.
I agree with that.
He's got the Hayek critique embedded in it.
Yeah, I think Lucas is a genius. He transformed economics, which is an amazing thing to do. It was a huge mistake for the Austrian economists of that generation to not try to communicate with him and view him as a partner in getting a more micro foundations of macroeconomics. But
can I ask you a weird question about Lucas?
Yeah.
Why is he not in the mainline economics that you draw out between Adam Smith to Vernon Smith? You have a whole bunch of other people in there.
Yeah.
And when I read it, I didn't think about that. Like all the people who are in it belong there. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. So what is it about Lucas that he doesn't quite belong there?
Friedman and Stigler aren't in there either.
I know, but Lucas is different from Friedman, because Lucas is not a positivist like Friedman, right? So that's one point of difference that Lucas might belong in this list.
So you could, I could be persuaded, but this is how I would put it, is that what I mean by mainline economics is those individuals that tried to square two basic facts of the world. The one fact is that individuals strive to do the best that they can given their situation. We call that the rational choice postulate.
Yeah.
Now I would make a qualification and say rational choice is if the choosers are human.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're fallible but capable human choosers, not infallible choosers. And they're not maximizing in the sense that we know the full array. Yeah. And the second one is Paris gets fed, which is the idea that there's an invisible hand mechanism. So that's the invisible hand. So we have the rational choice postulate and the invisible hand proposition. And the question is, how do you square the two together? Now, one way is to deny that they go together. And that tends to be the critics of the market.
Yeah.
Marx, Veblen, Keynes. And they go at it in various modern behavioral economics. They go at it in various different ways. So I actually would highlight Keynes's essay, The End of Laissez-Faire.
Yes.
Because in that he explicitly says that there is no invisible hand, basically. He argues there is individuals suffer from weakness of will, so there's no rational actor. The price system doesn't coordinate economic activity. There is no force from above that guarantees that they could coordinate, and there's no force from below. So to Keynes, you're stuck. That's the whole point of an unemployment equilibrium. You're stuck in a disequilibrium, and the only solution out of it is a deus machina who can come in and fix from outside the system, which is why you have to be outside the system to come in. All right, so that's one side. The other side goes back to your as-if people, which is what they do is they collapse the one onto the other.
Yeah.
So they collapse the one onto the other. So what I want to say is that all of the people, this goes back to early part of our conversation, all of the individuals that are in what I call the main line derive the invisible hand proposition from the rational postulate, but via institutional analysis. So the institutional analysis becomes a critical part of whether or not you can see the invisible hand of the coordination of Paris getting fed. And that means that you're going to have property, contract, and consent. So it's that focus on those individuals. So all those individuals from Adam Smith and David Hume up through the French economists like, Bastiat and Say, into the late classical economists like Mill, into the early neoclassical economists, to the Austrians, and then in the post-1950 era to the people like Buchanan, Coase, North, Smith, and Elinor Ostrom. There are, of course, other people, but the reason why those names get is because they're Nobel Prize winners. And a part of that is sociological, and I'll explain this and very, very quickly, and it's my own like insecurities and weaknesses. When I got out of graduate school, I got the job of a lifetime. I got to work at New York University as an assistant professor. It was a dream come true for me. It's where Ludwig von Mises taught. It's where my undergraduate professor got his PhD. It's where my graduate advisor got his PhD. I was going to go work with Israel Kirzner and Mario Rizzo and Ludwig Lachmann, both there and also at various functions that I would go to because I was at NYU. And I was an IHS baby, Institute for Humane Studies baby. They'd been supporting me forever. I became like their poster child along with David Schmitz. David Schmitz at the time was at Yale. So they used to bring us out all the time to all their seminars and talk to all the students. And I'd meet very bright students like yourself and others that are, wanting to maybe go and get a degree. And anyone that was in economics, they would sit there and they would say to me, but you're not really mainstream. Okay, this is what they say. You're not really mainstream. And I'd be like, I don't know what that means. Like, I studied with Ken Boulding. He's the second John Bates Clark Medal winner. I studied with Jim Buchanan. He's a Nobel Prize winner. I studied with Gordon Tullock. He actually is the Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association. So, like, who is it that you studied with? Like, I studied with academic royalty in economics. So, like, what are we talking about here? Like, why are you making these, like, comments? And one of the things was Boulding always used to make the distinction between mainline economics and other economics. He has a great essay. It's called After Samuelson, Who Needs Smith? Yeah. And in it, he develops this notion of what he calls the extended present. Yeah. And his argument is that the evolutionary potential of Adam Smith's science is still there. So Adam Smith is still part of our conversation. Yeah. And that's part of the main line. Okay. Yeah. So I got this idea from him. So I used to say, like, no, maybe I'm not mainstream, but I'm main line. Yeah. Right. It's like, and the thought experiment that came to my head was if I was a Martian and I came to the Earth in 1780 and I said I was an economist, what would people think that economists believed? If I came to the Earth in the middle of the 19th century, what would they think that economists believed? And I know the answer to that because all you have to do is read like Charles Dickens and his discussion of the philosophical radicals in like Hard Times, which is Mr. Goddard's school, right? Which is the utilitarians. If I go to, 1890s and I listen to Thorstein Veblen criticize economists and he's like, oh, the lightning calculator of pleasure of playing. That's what an economist believes. So what I started realizing is that, okay, so if I'm a Martian and I come, everyone's going to say an economist believes that Paris gets fed and that individuals are pursuing their self-interest. So, okay, so like, what is it that made these things? The only time it ever stops being that is after Keynes. So once we get to Keynes, all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. In fact, in Keynes himself, you still would have been a Marshall. If you were a Martian and came, you still would have thought that's what an economist is because Keynes refers to himself as part of the rogues gallery in economics, right? That he's part of the new economics is actually the old economics, which was the criticism of all this other economics. So to me, I was like, okay, so those who sit in the seat of Adam Smith, right? This is Buchanan's line in What Should Economists Do, right? It's those who sit in the seat of Adam Smith. So I was like carrying out that idea. But again, the idea is that individuals are striving to do the best that they can given their circumstances. And the byproduct of all of these individuals striving within a certain institutional context is going to give us this invisible hand of the coordination of the market. That united the economics of that. And that's what I wanted to try to see and then contrast it with people that either deny that or collapse it.
Yeah.
Because when they collapse it, they forget the institutions that make it possible. And so I don't think that we can have the coordination of economic activity without private property, the rule of law, and things like that. So that's why I argue that Hayek's move in that second and third arc of his career is the founding of new institutional economics.
But I think Lucas would fit that description, right? Lucas thinks about how Paris gets fed, and Lucas thinks about rational choice very, very seriously. Yeah. And in fact, Lucas has the third element, a very Buchanan-esque element, which is when there is some kind of, let's say like a given structure, an exogenous structure of someone announcing interest rates or someone announcing monetary policy, how does everyone around them adapt, whether it's the right one or the wrong one, right?
Yeah.
So there is this process that has to take place for people to adapt to government success or government failure in this case. So I feel like Lucas sort of checks all those boxes. Lucas also comes from sort of the seat of Adam Smith in the second arc of his career, which is as a growth economist and a development economist, because he's very much directly studying those questions. And, when I first read Living Economics, I didn't think about, Lucas belongs here and he's missing. Lucas recently passed away.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, Lucas in a broader context and sort of what we've learned. And I thought again, Lucas, very similar to Adam Smith, is unwilling to treat people within the economy like pawns on a chessboard who can just be moved around.
I mean, definitely that is part of his whole idea is that, in fact, I remember when I was a graduate student, there was an Economist cover, and it actually had that. They were trying to explain the invariance proposition.
Yeah.
Because that was like big at the time. Remember that new classical macroeconomics, when it first became popular, it was summarized in the invariance proposition. Yeah. Later, it just was a methodology of having these micro foundations, right? And especially when you have the new Keynesians like Larry Summers and Greg Menke and Janet Yellen and others who were trying to show that you could have unemployment models with rational agents, which was a key part of all this. It's intriguing, by the way. I just started reading Ned Phelps's new book on a journey through economic theory, and I'm sure this will make me think about this again. I do agree with you about Lucas and the making an economic miracle. In that paper and his work in that, just like Romer's work, Romer focuses on charter cities for a reason, which is that's basically constitutional economics, right? Yeah. Acemoglu and Robinson, want us to think about institutions and constitutions as well. And so again, that work is all pushing in that way. Schleifer in the work that he did in the 90s on law and finance, very much, in those. But I don't mention those guys. My mistake, probably. And
no, it's interesting because there are points when the mainline and mainstream converge,
right,
and there are points when they diverge. And the Nobel Prizes are these weird moments when, suddenly the mainstream will acknowledge.
Right. And so that drove a lot of the naming is that in the modern idea, and those guys haven't won yet. They'll win, and then I'll take credit for him or whatever.
I think the next edition should have Lucas.
Yeah, I'm going to think about that, actually. It's a very good idea, especially Romer, I think, too.
Yeah, Romer, too.
Because even in Romer's Nobel address, he emphasizes this issue about the move towards treating agents with novelty and creativity. And I've been thinking about that a lot because in our community, there is, again, in the Coasian kind of world, we think about someone like Stephen Chung. And, he has this wonderful piece called The Fable of the Bees, right? Yeah. And he explains this kind of idea. And a lot of people, what they focus on is the end product, which is that an efficient contract was formed. And I want to try to say to everyone, okay, I get it, that an efficient contract, that's amazing. But why don't we recognize the following thing? Step one, there must have been a massive externality that they didn't recognize to begin with. Step two, creative and clever people came up with solution. Yeah. And it took them a while to get that solution to work out. But what we should focus on is not so much that they came up with a solution that was at one point optimal, but that they were coming up with a solution and what conditions allowed them to negotiate around to do that. Yeah. And so if you do the Coasian interpretation of Chung, you end up with the focus on prior to the contract, all the activity that led to the contract. Yeah. And to me, that's where all the action is in economics. And I really like this recent article by Brian Arthur called Economics in Nouns, Economics in Verbs. And his argument is that for us to make progress in the next generation of economic theory, we have to move from an economics of nouns, which is an economics of states of affairs, to an economics of verbs, which is about activity.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what we need to actually embrace. And he acknowledges that we already have a body of economic theory that works with verbs. That's called Austrian economics. And so to me, I think that's what we need to, work on. But if we're going to be doing that economics of activity, we have to remember that activity doesn't take place inside of a vacuum. Yeah. It always takes place inside of what? As institutional context. And that institutional context structures our incentives. Yeah. And we shouldn't deny that. But it more importantly controls and dictates the flow and quality of the information and knowledge that we can discover and work with. And so by focusing on that, so let me just say one last thing about this knowledge issue. One way to think about the great mainline economists, Buchanan, Hayek, Coase, Ostrom, Vernon Smith, is that they look at the world through, in many ways, a neoclassical prism. Actors are choosing on the margin against constraints, right? Yeah. And so it's not like they're saying, there's no constraints or there's no margins or whatever, right? They're choosing on the margin against the world of given constraints, right? They're facing these trade-offs. But what they do is they slightly always twist the prism. Yeah. And they twist the prism differently than what, say, you would get in a standard graduate level textbook, Varian. Yeah. And by twisting that prism, it opens up these new lights. Yeah. And so Eleanor makes us think about collective action problems in a way that when I was Mansur Olson or Garrett Hardin, I'm in a remorseless trap and I can't get out of it. But she twists it and all of a sudden I can get out of it by various different creative and clever actors inside of my model doing things. And Eleanor is a fascinating example. At the very end of her book, she has a section, so it's 214 and following in the Governing the Commons. And it's called The Challenge Towards Scholarship that her position takes. And the main idea is that she says, we don't want to have an economics about governing over. We need to have an economics that's suited for governing with. Yeah. And then she goes through a whole thing about self-governing democratic societies. And she ends up at the end not talking about common pool resources, but instead self-governing democratic societies and the nature of those, and Tocqueville and Madison and Hobbes and Smith and all these people like that. And that's how she ends her book. And so to me, what that tells us is that what her book was about was test bedding democratic self-governance within a really hairy problem, which is collective action faced with a common pool resource, or basically fugitive resources like the fisheries or whatever. And how is it that individuals come to solve their problems themselves from inside of the model themselves? And so to me, I think that's just like, we need more of that kind of stuff and more embracing of that. And I think that's different than all the people that do the economics. But I'm going to think about this Lucas thing a lot. Thank you.
One way I would frame that question is, what do each of these theorists consider endogenous to the model versus exogenous to the model, right? So you do have people who sit on the seat of Adam Smith, like someone like Kerzner, for instance, right? Who still thinks institutions are given and fixed, not because he actually thinks institutions don't change or something like that, but for what he's studying, right, which is the process within the market. Yeah. Institutions are given and fixed, and we're going to take that as given and fixed, and then we're going to do what economists do, right? Now, if you were to introduce a slightly different kind of Austrian economist, if you bring in Lachmann, right, or Mario Rizzo, they sort of made their career out of endogenizing the institutions that many Austrians before them took as given and fixed, right? So they were very Hayekian in that sense, right? Now, if you look at what, for instance, Buchanan has done, right? He's endogenized a whole number of institutions, including lawmaking, but what is given to us is the Constitution. Because we did something in the Constitution making. We got this moment, we got the Constitution, then, the relatively absolute, right? That's relatively given and fixed. Now, Ostrom goes one step further, right? So we don't have this relatively given or exogenous and fixed Constitution. In fact, part of solving the specific problem includes solving that bigger constitutional problem. They're actually the same thing to Eleanor Ostrom. So she also endogenizes that element, which, Buchanan is sort of left on the table as exogenous. So I honestly think of it as really where they are placing the model. I mean, economists, until very recently, preferences are given and fixed, right? And no human being's preferences are actually given and fixed. And it's only very recently, and Buchanan is part of that, he starts endogenizing preference formation in some sense, right? And then behavioral economists are like, no, preferences are given and fixed, and that's what they should look like. That's a normative benchmark. So that's sort of how I think about, reframing the mainline and mainstream economics. And if I go with this, I think Lucas and, then even Schelling belongs,
Sure.
right?
Schelling definitely belongs.
Yeah, so Schelling belongs. And Romer, the weird thing about Romer is, I feel like he's the one who's really answering the original Adam Smith question of, what makes certain places poor versus rich, right? Wherever I look, and I'm thinking about this from a development economics point of view, everything that people are trying to engineer, right, into people having better lives, right? People not living in poverty and squalor and all the things you mentioned. Romer has all the places that look good have figured out, right, the endogenous growth theory. Something is working there. All the ideas are sort of cross-pollinating, right? Or as Matt Ridley would say, ideas are having sex. Where all the good places look like that and all the places in decline look slightly different.
I think that, so just to start with the issue with Romer, I think that one of the key issues is that his notions of increasing returns is Smithian, not Ricardian.
Yes.
And most people don't make that distinction. They just go with Ricardian increasing returns, and that's the way they think about these things. And so they don't get the point of the generalized increasing returns, which of course Buchanan emphasized as well with his work with Yoon. And so that's like a key issue. How do we work with that kind of idea? I think if we go back to my earlier discussion about the move from logically soundness to logical validity, that one of the issues that happened was with logical validity, we ended up by having the notion that we could have that abstractions entailed unrealism. So we allowed for unrealism of assumptions. This is one of Friedman's mistakes, because even go back and look at the debate between Friedman and Samuelson in the AER, where Samuelson defends the realism of assumptions. But Friedman unleashed economists by saying it doesn't matter, you can have these unrealistic. And I think that's a huge issue, because I think that in the Austrians, they deal with abstractions, but they're realistic. So they're not unrealistic abstractions, they're realistic abstractions, which hold their feet to the fire of the world in some sense. And I think that's important. The other thing I just wanted to mention to you about the endogenizing of institutions is Buchanan has this great passage in the beginning of The Demand and Supply of Public Goods, in which he argues that economists can no longer be content treating the institutional framework as fixed and given, but they must derive the institutional framework itself. And then he adds, from the ordinary behavioral assumptions of the economists themselves. And I think the way he chose to do that was his constitutional economics. And that's why he gets to all of the things. Now, the reason why he does the veil of ignorance and those kind of issues, that goes back to an issue with Knight, which has to do draining us of having motivated reasoners, because motivated reasoners will undermine the voluntary process of it all. So instead, he wants to have, various different efforts. But the difference between him and Ostrom in that regard is that exercise, the veil of ignorance, allows him to have rational discourse without any squabbling. Ostrom, if you listen to her, there's a great movie. She does an interview. She was a wonderful human being, just absolutely wonderful person.
She came and did her Nobel laureate tour, starting with Mason when I was a graduate student.
You remember. She was just like
and she drank scotch with all of us, and she was so fun and so cool, but also just so involved in what every single person was working on.
When you were talking to her, you thought she made you feel like you're $1 million. And
she made us feel human.
She's just amazing. But like what she does, she laughs. And she says, you know what we found when we studied, people making decisions? We found that they quarrel. They fight all the time. And she chuckles about it. And she says they have to figure out a way. So in my book, Struggle for a Better World, I take that idea of that conflict. Wagner, of course, has worked with this conflict issue as well. Dick Wagner is a Buchanan student, your teacher or whatever. He's brilliant. But I use this idea of what I call sharp objects. Now, I will admit it comes from, watching the HBO show on sharp objects. I'm not that brilliant, but I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. These notions that we interact in the world in sharp objects. And what happens is that we have to figure out a way that our institutions dull the edges of the objects, because in our conflicts with one another, if they're not dulled, what we're going to do is we're going to have mortal wounds. But instead, if they're dulled, we're going to end up by getting scraped and bruised, but we'll still be able to cooperate with one another. And I thought this is an analogy for the way in which we interact in a pluralistic society. That comes from Eleanor. because we're wrestling over these scarcities and who has what, when, and where, and we're arguing over these things.
And also who's included and excluded from the decision making, right?
And that has to be a constant conversation and negotiated and adjudicated all the time. Power relations are all involved in that. Think about all the things that she allows us to open up into that space of institutional analysis, which is different from the more rarefied discussion of institutions that you see in other economies. Another way to think about it is they all fill in gaps of one another.
Yeah. So
you start with some and they get there, but there's a gap. And then the next person picks up their framework and then fills in that gap. Hayek gives us a program and they build on that. And they, and I think again, to go back about Hayekian ideas, what you're talking about is the evolution of this various arcs. So he goes economics as coordination problem, the abuse of reason project, the restatement of liberalism, and then philosophical anthropology. Yeah. And what happens in the philosophical anthropology is pushing the coevolution and spontaneous order story farther and farther into all of us. So the origins of our mores are in fact in these, spontaneous orders. And so he was pushing that agenda as far as he could run it. I think there's so much richness in the discussion of political economy and social philosophy that these thinkers have that we can learn from and continually to push out. And again, it's not about the thinker. I think that's a mistake. It's about the concepts that these thinkers work with.
And it's the context that they choose to bring into the model or leave out of the model.
And so we have to make, these things alive for us today. The young people that are listening to the show here, whether or not they're overseas or here in the States or whatever, they have to learn how to make these ideas speak to them today and speak to their students, right? And, that's a key thing. If I could stress again, I think that the key thing about mainline economics, when it's taught right, is that it's a tool for the curious. Yeah. Economics is a tool of social understanding for those who are curious about how the world works. It is not a tool for social control by those who want to, engineer the system. Adam Smith used just a simple phrase of the man of systems. Yeah. But he also says that it's nowhere as dangerous as in the man who fancies himself to presume that he could in fact control the lives of others. Menger referred to it as Prussian police science. when we teach economics as a tool of social control, we're teaching economics as Prussian police science. When we teach economics as a tool of social understanding, then we're sort of teaching economics as a branch of moral philosophy.
And, there's also the in-between. We think we are teaching economics the right way, but it can become an instrument of social control if we get it wrong, which is what the whole AI and computation question tells me. That if you're really thinking that people's tacit knowledge doesn't matter, and it's just a matter of, given data or information that now we have this supercomputer that can resolve, not only have we gotten the model of how the real world works or the process works wrong, we can also do a lot of damage, right?
Maybe this might give a good example. George Soros made billions of dollars as an international currency trader.
Yes, and bet against the Bank of England famously.
And one of his policy prescription in his retirement has been that he wants to have a world central bank because he wants to get rid of the spread in international currencies that he arbitraged and made so much money on. Yeah. And I think that it's really counterintuitive to a guy like him that his very behavior was the thing that stabilized markets, right? It was that he and others were in fact arbitraging that actually gave the market its order. And if we didn't do that, how the hell is the central bank going to know how to actually, do things? Now,
And an alternate view of the world which can achieve the same thing is sort of lots of decentralized banks, right? Which is the Hayekian view.
Right.
Like you have lots of denationalization, right? You have lots of different currencies. And now you have all the crypto guys who come in and who say, we can do the same thing, right? And not so controlled by an individual.
That's the thing that so many people that don't get the kind of mainline idea miss. They miss the benefits of the competitive process of contestation. Yeah. They miss it in terms of experts, that experts need to be contested. It's not, like Hayek is a criticism. He says, he quotes Hume. He says he's going to use reason to whittle down the claims of reason. Yeah. He's not denying reason. Yeah. He's using reason to whittle down the claims of reason so that we can have reasonable reason, right? And it's the same thing with experts. No one here is an anti-expert. Yeah. What they want is they're monopoly of experts. And so we don't want to concentrate the power in the hands of a few, because if we concentrate the power in the hands of a few, and even a sincere error by the hands of a few can threaten the entire system, it's a system we can't afford. Yeah. So we need to have constant contestation and built-in resiliency and, tests and whatnot. And that's this institutional design question.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't like the decentralized process stuff that we talk about, because there is some attraction we want everything universally to be uniform. And when there are lots of decentralized actors and we don't know exactly what they know and we don't know exactly what they think and we don't know exactly what context they inhabit, that makes people very nervous. Because if we don't know it all, then how can we, intervene and sort of create certain uniform outcomes for them? Right? So in our pursuit for uniformity of outcome, or what we try to call, this kind of equality that everyone is looking for, I think the appreciation for diversity and decentralization and sort of pluralism gets taken away. Like sure. That's the institutional or intellectual trade-off that we're constantly making at the political level.
Yeah. I mean, Scott Page, has these great, models where he tests the idea of diversity and the power of diversity, because it gives us creativity, novelty, and whatnot that we otherwise wouldn't have if it wasn't there, right? Yeah. And it's the same reason why you want to have different voices. You want to test your ideas out in different environments and everything like that. It's kind of, it's a very fascinating issue to think about what generates a creative society. Yeah. So Hayek has in the Constitutional Liberty, one of my favorite chapters is a chapter called The Creative Powers of a Free Civilization. Yes. And if you read that chapter, he doesn't tell you that he knows what the creative society would ever give us. In fact, it's the opposite. Yeah. Right? It's that what it does is we maximize the chances for accidents to give us things that we didn't know we wanted, but now we know we want. Yeah. And he actually quotes in there, Lewis, who was one of his students at the LSE, the first black man to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and a professor, at LSE. And Sir Arthur Lewis, he in that discussion that Hayek has there, it's all about innovation and how innovation comes from minorities. Yeah. Because minorities see things differently than others see it. So so a fish doesn't recognize the water that it swims in. So if I'm a native, if I'm a majority, I don't recognize what the opportunities might be. But I come in and I'm a minority and I'm blocked off, and necessity is the mother of invention. And I'm like, you know what? That's pretty cool. Yeah. And I come in there and I do that. And I think that kind of permissionless innovation, that kind of system that is constantly in churning, it's upsetting to people because they want stability. But at the same time, it's the source of why it is that we have all the cornucopia of beautiful things that we have. Yeah. And most of human history, in fact, didn't have that. It was like, like this, and then whoop, like this. And the question is, what just happened here that unleashed this power of a free civilization?
Yeah, and I think Hayek sums that up beautifully in the title, because it's individualism and economic order. So you get the order, but you also get the individualism. In fact, you get the order because of the individualism. Yeah. But thank you so much for doing this, Pete. This was such a pleasure. It feels like I'm back in your classroom.
No, it was a lot of fun to have this conversation with you, and I learned a lot, and I'm gonna now rethink some of my characterizations and take into account some other people.
I think it's a great opportunity for the next edition. Yeah. And we know that the second edition is now not, I mean, if there's another chapter on Lucas and Romer and, Schelling, then the first one can't compete with it. Exactly. So you can not only create a new product, but you can also make more money out of this. So this was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.